Police officers in South Africa have been ordered, or rather there's a directive not to arrest people for possession and use of marijuana for personal use. Ground-up reports that the South African Police Services Directive, dated 23 August 2023, appears to instruct officers to no longer arrest people for personal cultivation and or possession of cannabis. Back in 2018, the Constitutional Court ruled that possession and cultivation of cannabis for private use was legal. We're now joined by Shaad Vayej, legal expert at Cullinan and Associates, as well as founder of Only Farms. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, Shaad. Perhaps let's take a look at that directive as signed by the Police Commissioner, Fannie Masemola, which is on Ground-Up's website. If you can pull that up for our viewers to take a look as well. It reads, arrests by the South African Police Service for cannabis-related matters. Following the 2018 Constitutional Court judgment, the Minister of Justice and Constitutional Development and others versus Prince, National Director of Public Prosecutions, and others versus Ruben, National Director of Public Prosecutions, and others versus Anton and others, there appears to be confusion as to the legal position in relation to cannabis. Help us demystify this confusion. What is that about?
Sure. Thank you, Dudu, and thank you for having me on the show. So from the outset, it must be said that a directive by the police is not law and doesn't change the law. But this directive is incredibly valuable insight into what the SAPS's interpretation is of the law and as applicable to cannabis-related matters. So as you said, since the 2018 Prince judgment, cannabis cultivation and possession in private for personal consumption by private adults has been allowed. And this principle has been read into our legislation by the Constitutional Court. However, dealing in cannabis, the whole plant or any portion thereof, as defined by the Drugs and Drugs Trafficking Act, is still a criminal offence. So notably, there is no law which specifies what quantities of cannabis constitute dealing in, nor is there any law which allows for the presumption of dealing in where quantities are found to exceed any particular threshold. So while the medical and industrial sides of cannabis have somewhat clear guidelines issued by the relevant government departments, what quantities of cannabis found or behavior in a particular instance constitutes dealing in or personal use has been largely left to the reasonable interpretation of SAPS members in that instance. And this has created a window of uncertainty which has led to cases of wrongful arrest and exposes the SAPS to civil claims. So at a meeting held in June of this year called the Cannabis and Hemp Pakisa, key government role players got together to strategize on a way forward for the cannabis industry in South Africa. And the issue of this uncertainty was raised, and this directive represents the first tangible outcome we are seeing from the Pakisa. So to jump into the directive itself, and without repeating the directive in verbatim, I'll go through the highlights. So this was a directive issued by the head of the Priority Crimes Unit for distribution across the entire SAPS chain of command. It also requires the signature of each and every police officer to acknowledge that they understand this directive, and advises them that should they breach it, disciplinary action may be faced. So, as I said, this directive provides insight into what the SAPS understands as constituting a private space, which is essentially a space where the public does not have access to as a right. So that's not a beach or a park, for instance. The directive also takes this definition a step further by providing that a physical barrier preventing access is not a requirement of a private space. So that would mean, for instance, a township or other instances where physical barriers are not apparent. And then secondly, a person does not need to be an owner of the space for it to be their private space. So this means that private cannabis can be grown on property that's leased, for instance. Cannabis is considered privately possessed if hidden from view or when carried in public. The inside of a motor vehicle is considered a private space. Cannabis dispensed by traditional, cultural or religious healers in small quantities is privately and personally possessed. Notably here that the SAPS have provided the qualification of small quantities, and what that means in a particular instance is of course up to the reasonable interpretation of that SAPS member in that instance.
Sure. Shaad, if you just allow me to join you, please. So if you take a look at this directive, it reads that since there's no definition or quantification of the concept of personal consumption, as you mentioned, the South African Police Services is at risk if they arrest a person for possession, use or cultivation, and such matter is not enrolled, struck off the roll unlawful or otherwise does not result in prosecution. It exposes the South African Police Service to civil claims for unlawful arrest and detention. What should we read in there? How many civil claims have we seen where this is concerned? Is this an admission that the current legislation is really not working well for the police?
I mean, I can't really speak to how many current cases there are of unlawful arrest. There have been, but I am aware of that there have been instances of this. And what it does speak to is the need for a globular legislative reform where we have clarity on what is and what isn't allowed. Right now, cannabis is legislated in a piecemeal fashion, partly by the Drugs Act, partly by the Medicines Act, and also the Plant Improvement Act. So yes, it does speak to the fact that we do need legislative reform, and that reform is underway, which is sort of evidenced by this directive. We also have what's known as the Hayes Club case, which has not been finalized. And in this case, a declarator has been sought from the courts surrounding the legality of collective growing and ownership of cannabis under what's known as the Cannabis Grow Club. We do have to wait and see what transpires there.
Okay, here's what cannabis users will be most interested in, what they want to know, because the directive reads, no arrests are to be made for personal and private cultivation and or possession of cannabis, which activities are not criminal. Furthermore, no arrests of alleged cannabis offenders should be effected merely for the reason to achieve predetermined targets and without assurance that there is indeed a crime that will be enrolled and prosecuted by the National Prosecuting Authority. In a nutshell, what is it, especially in light of this directive, do cannabis users need to know?
What they need to know is that dealing in cannabis and the commercialization of cannabis without a license or permit under the Medicines Act or the Plant Improvement Framework is still not allowed. But private cultivation, personal consumption in private is allowed. This, and as the directive states, you know, the arrests are not being prioritized as a means to, or in relation to cannabis-related offences, as a means to achieve predetermined targets. So it's essentially the police saying that private private consumption or personal consumption of cannabis is allowed. I mean, this directive does also speak to the Cannabis Club question. 6.1.5 of it actually refers to more than one person may have ownership rights to personal and private cannabis. So this means cannabis can be privately owned and cultivated for personal use collectively. However, we do still have to await the outcome. And like I said earlier, this isn't law, so we do have to await the outcome of the Hayes Club case to determine that. So from a personal perspective, it's all well and good.
So if you get stopped by the police, especially because the directive also speaks about there's no legislation that prescribes rather what quantities of cannabis may be possessed or cultivated, don't get excited as yet. Still be careful. Indeed.
Still be careful. But at the same time, know your rights. Know that this is the directive that's been issued to the SAPS, and that the SAPS, if behaving outside of this directive, the members may face disciplinary action. So I advise the public to pay attention to what this directive says, to pay attention to what this directive says, and to acquaint themselves with the principles of what constitutes private consumption of cannabis.
Sure. Shaad, we can see that there's someone who's competing for your attention, so we'll say thank you for your time this afternoon. Shaad Vayej is a legal analyst at Cullinan and Associates and founder of OnlyFarms. More news for you in a few moments.